本日、ALS カフェ、いよいよ最後のセッションとなりました。海外の ALS の取り組みということで、本日はリチャード・ベッドラック先生、米国からお話をご紹介いただけること大変光栄に存じます。リチャード・ベッドラック先生は、ヒッチュアード・ヒューズ・ウェント、ALS の特別教授でありまして、デューク大学 ALS プログラムのリーダーであります。現在世界で最も注目されているニューロロジストでありまして、今回 ALS カフェの冒頭で、加納先生からご紹介がありましたけれども、ALS クリニカルリサーチラーニングインスティテュートや ALS アンタングルドプログラムを通して、ALS 患者さんに様々な選択の機会、治療あるいはケアに関する科学的なエビデンスをご提供することで、多くの ALS の患者さんに正しい、あるいはご本人主体的な選択ができるような、そういうネットワークを作っていらっしゃるということで、日頃から敬服いたしております。ベドラック先生、今日、アメリカ深夜で大変眠たいところ、大変申し訳ございませんけれども、先生のお話を聞くために500名が登録をしていると聞いておりますので、ぜひよろしくお願いいたします。我々日本からアメリカの試みを、伺えることを楽しみにしておりました。それでは、ベテラン先生よろしくお願いいたします。
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. It's been a long time since I've been in a cafe at 2:30 in the morning, but it's a pleasure to be here. And I'm going to tell you about some unusual work that I've been doing for more than 10 years now. It's so unusual that it sounds a little bit like an episode of the TV show called The X-Files. This was one of my favorite TV shows. It ran over here in the United States for about 10 years. And it's centered around a character by the name of Fox Mulder. So when he was young, his baby sister, Samantha, disappeared, and he was supposed to be watching her. So he felt this terrible guilt. Now, the way he remembered it, she was kidnapped by aliens. Of course, nobody believed him. So the guilt that he felt, it fueled this passion to prove to the world that strange supernatural things like aliens really existed. And so every episode of The X-Files would start out with some unusual happening, and Mulder and his team would investigate, and usually they would find some rational explanation for what happened. So I had my own version of Samantha. She was a 60-year-old university professor that I saw early in my career, and unfortunately I had to diagnose her with ALS. The first time I saw her, she was quite early in the disease, just a little bit of limb weakness, a little bit of slurred speech, but no obvious cognitive or behavioral problems. She was still working. Following education about the disease, I presented her with stage-appropriate evidence-based management options, which included the drug Riluzole and multidisciplinary team care. And I also asked her if she wanted to be in one of the research studies that I had open. And much to my surprise, she said she would be happy to come to clinic and take the medication, but she was going to pass on the research study. Instead, she was planning to try something that she read about on the internet called Dean Kraft's energy healing. Now, this was a very smart woman, and she didn't really have a good explanation for how energy healing might work, but she couldn't get away from this video that was on the Dean Kraft website. And I want to show you the video now.
In 1985, Nelda Buss was diagnosed with ALS, amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, better known as Lou Gehrig's disease.
It was my birthday. I was 43 years old, and they told me I had Lou Gehrig's disease. Well, they actually said amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, and I still wasn't real sure what that was.
ALS is a medical mystery. There is no known cause and no known cure.
The established medical profession, they just said, goodbye, see you, have a good life, live it to your fullest.
The disease inevitably progresses from partial to complete paralysis of all the muscles in the body.
She just kept getting progressively worse. And I guess from the time she was diagnosed until she was basically an invalid was only about 6 months or something.
In the final stages of ALS, Nelda had become a quadriplegic, unable to move, but mentally alert and aware that she was about to die.
I gave away most of my good clothing that I had, and I had my dress all picked out for what I was to be buried in.
Then Nelda heard about Dean Kraft.
And it was just such a relief to talk to him. I said that the doctors say there's no hope. And he said, well, that's not always true.
Kraft did his laying on of hands for 3 months, and then they had a small but significant breakthrough.
In May, Glenn was showering me and I could move my toe, and that was so exciting.
After her toes, Nelda slowly regained movement in her fingers, then her back muscles. Soon she could control her hands, then her arms and her legs. Nelda worked very hard on her own physical exercise regimen, in addition to treatments from Dean Kraft. Her family videotaped her progress over the course of a year.
It's wonderful to see her and her family being together and enjoying life together. Words cannot express the feeling that one has when this happens.
Okay. How's that?
Everything has changed. She's back and she's doing more than she ever did before. I mean, it's great to have a mother. It really is.
I hope you'll agree that that is a pretty amazing video. So for the purposes of today's talk, Dean Kraft's energy healing is an example of something that I call alternative or off-label therapies. I abbreviate those as AOTs, and I define them as treatments that are advertised to slow, stop, or reverse ALS without what most of us would consider to be scientific evidence. And it turns out that my patient is not the only one who's considering these. So surveys suggest that most people with ALS will try at least one AOT over the course of their illness. Why do they do this? Well, even though we're making a lot of progress and we have a lot more therapies now than we ever have, the current treatments, and even those that are coming out in the next few years, they're designed to slightly slow the progression of the disease and improve quality of life. You know, we don't have something coming in the next couple of years anyway that looks like it's going to cure ALS. And so like this old X-Files movie poster, people with this disease want to believe that they're going to find something better. So 10% think they're going to find a cure, 20% think they're going to find something to make them stronger, and the rest think they're going to find something to at least slow progression. And into this difficult background comes the internet, which makes it easier than ever for someone who's looking for an AOT to find one. If you take out your phone and you do a Google search on ALS treatment, you will literally get millions of hits. Now, not all of these things are AOTs, but many of them, including some of the first ones that come up, usually are. The other thing about the internet is that it's got a lot of information, but there are no internet police to make sure that the information is accurate. And so you will see things out there, such as some of the phrasing on this website: world's most relied upon, clinically proven, guaranteed to work, perfectly safe, without any substantial evidence to support those kinds of claims. If we do get any evidence, what we typically get are what I call anecdotes. These are little stories of people who supposedly took the AOT and usually had something good happen to them. And so here's another example of an anecdote that I pulled off the internet. This one actually came from the website of a pharmaceutical company called Genervon that was developing a drug called GM604. And basically it says, after reviewing this patient's past medical history, it's in the treating doctor's opinion that they've greatly benefited from GM604 over the past 6 weeks when this drug was given. During our initial assessment, the patient had fasciculations, but these decreased dramatically. The patients also stopped biting their tongue. This is a reversal and an unexpected benefit. And furthermore, the patient's limb weakness has plateaued. She's not progressing anymore. Okay. Well, again, I mean, that sounds pretty interesting, but there may be some potential problems here, right? So first of all, we don't actually know who this person is or how their diagnosis was confirmed. There's an old cartoon that says, on the internet, nobody knows you're a dog. And it turns out to be worse than that. There are now multiple examples of companies who have been found to be paying their employees to just fabricate anecdotes, stories of people who took their products with great results when they really never happened. And some of them are being taken to court now. The other problem with anecdotes is that we're sometimes given measurements that it's hard to make any sense out of. Like that Jenner Von anecdote, it talked about a reduction in fasciculations, muscle twitching. Well, I've been doing this now for 23 years. I've seen about 4,000 people with ALS. It's pretty rare that someone is bothered by their fasciculations so much that they want medicine for them. And we know from previous studies that there really isn't a good relationship between the amount of fasciculations or the location of the fasciculations and how the disease is going to progress. So they're not really a useful way to measure ALS. But the biggest and most difficult problem with anecdotes is that they fail to account for the natural history of ALS. And so, most of us understand that people with ALS progress at different speeds. But what's not understood very well, unless you've taken care of a lot of people, is that the progression of ALS in a person can change over time. And so to prove this, a few years ago, some colleagues of mine and I went into a very large database, and we looked at patients who had participated in clinical trials, who had something called the ALS functional rating scale measured over long periods of time. And we focused on patients who were taking placebos because we didn't want to be tricked by any sort of drug effect. And you can see what happened to one of those patients there in the upper right-hand corner of my slide. That patient progressed, somewhat linearly for the first 250 days or so. Then they progressed pretty fast for another 150 days or so. Then they just stopped progressing completely. And then they actually got a little bit better for a while. So that is clearly not a straight line down. And so to answer the question about that Jenner Von anecdote and whether that's really something interesting, what I did is I mapped out all the patients in this database who were on placebos. And I looked at the percentage of them that had either a stable or an improving ALS FRSR score lasting different amounts of time. So that's what this bottom graph is. And if we focus on the blue line, that's a stable ALS FRSR score lasting different amounts of time. And the Jenner Von anecdote said the patient was taking the drug for 6 weeks. So I drew a red line on here. 75% of people on placebos have a period of 6 weeks where they don't progress. So clearly the Jenner Von anecdote is just telling us about the natural history of ALS. It's not evidence of treatment benefit. And so if you didn't recognize those problems with anecdotes, don't feel bad. Most non-scientists don't see those. And in fact, they think of anecdotes as being just as good or even better than the evidence that comes from clinical trials. We don't really know why this is, but we do know the consequence of it. It means that people with ALS and other terrible diseases who are considering AOTs on the internet are probably overestimating the potential benefits of the things that they're going to buy. And they're also probably underappreciating the potential harms. So I have found financial harms. Some of these products cost hundreds, some cost thousands, some cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. I found physical harms, patients who got infections, who got blood clots, who came back from a foreign stem cell clinic with tumors growing in their body comprised of someone else's cells. I've even found evidence of deaths occurring in some of these clinics that advertise themselves as perfectly safe. There's one more type of harm, and that is a scientific harm, and that has to do with enrollment rate. We don't enroll very fast in our clinical trials here in the United States. We enroll about 2 patients per site per month. That's a really small percentage of the patients that we see. And the result of that is our trials are taking longer than they need to. And it's going to take us longer to find a cure. And there's a lot of reasons for this, but certainly one of the reasons is that eligible patients, like the one I told you about in the beginning, they choose to self-experiment with things on the internet rather than come into clinical trials. So, frustrated by all this, a few years ago, I got together with some colleagues and we came up with a new idea. We wanted to create a program called ALS Untangled, a system for scientifically assessing these AOTs and helping patients and families make more informed decisions about them. And we've come up with 3 parts to our method: inputs, how we get our ideas; investigations, how we actually review them; and outputs, how we get the information back to patients and families. All of this revolves around a website that we created, which you heard about in the very beginning. It's www.alsuntangled.org. And so we get our ideas from patients and families, and they can come in by emails, they can come in by social media, they can come in by colleagues of mine who hear about these ideas in their clinics. And once we get a new idea, we put it on part of our website, which is called Future Reviews. And as you can see, we now have over 500 AOTs that patients and families around the world have asked us to review. There's so many of these that I know I will never get to all of them in my lifetime. And so we've had to come up with a way to prioritize them. And so we actually have a 2-part system. The first part is voting. Anybody in the world can go onto that part of our website and they can click the button next to the name of the AOT they're interested in. And we try to focus on the AOTs that have the most votes, that are near the top. But we also have something called a multiplier. We multiply the votes by 0, 1, or 2, depending on the amount of useful, disclosable information that we can find. What do I mean by that? Well, if I do a literature search and I look in social media and I can't find anybody who ever tried this and no one's even writing about it, or if I reach out to someone who's selling this and they tell me they're going to sue me if I write 1 word about it, well, the votes are going to be multiplied by 0 until that changes. We'll multiply them by 1 if there's anything out there that I can write about, and we'll multiply them by 2 if there's a case report, a case series, or a clinical trial, because that's where we get the most information. So we didn't find anybody else who was doing anything like this in any other disease. And I don't think there still is anyone doing it. And so we had to invent a way to do it. And first we put together a team. So just like Fox Mulder had an X-Files team, I've got an ALS Untangled team, and it's really grown. We now have 130 clinicians and scientists working together from across 11 different countries. And we have these standard operating procedures that we came up with that guide everything we do, from how we gather information, to how we write the draft, to how we crowdsource it, and ultimately publish it. And you can read those detailed methods on our website. So once we send our review into a journal, it gets an independent review from someone who's not on our team. And then we have to respond to those comments, and then it gets published in the journal. And all of our reviews so far have been published in the same journal. It's called ALS and Frontotemporal Degeneration. And one really nice thing is that the journal has agreed to make our reviews free open access. That means that no one ever has to pay to read these. We don't want patients and families to have to pay to read what we write about. And so you can find all the reviews that we've completed on the completed reviews page of our website. There's 71 completed reviews now. And if you don't want to read the whole review, you can see what kind of grades we gave it. Some of our reviews are getting pretty old. They're more than 10 years old. And so we've had to go back and update them because new information's come out. And so you'll see a little asterisk next to the name if we've updated it. We also know that not everybody wants to read a scientific paper. Some people would rather listen to someone talk about it. And so we've partnered with a group called Create, and now we have made podcasts. And so these podcasts are a person who has lived with ALS asking me questions about the review. And so these are sort of a different way of thinking about the individual AOTs. If you see a little speaker icon next to the name of the review, that means there's a podcast. And then finally, we've realized that, people all over the world are interested in these products, and not all of them are fluent in English. And so we've tried to start getting the website translated. And so far, we've got Spanish and Italian translations. We would love to have more. So this looks like a lot of work, and it is a lot of work. I'll say that for at least 10 years, there's hardly been a night or a weekend that I haven't been working on this program. And so it's fair to ask, is it worth it? Well, I can tell you that we have won a lot of awards from patient groups, awards from peer groups. People are reading our articles. So our journal keeps track of the most downloaded articles in its history, and we have 8 of the top 10. Some of our individual reviews have more than 40,000 downloads, and collectively the series has more than 300,000, and our podcasts have over 25,000 listens. The other thing I can tell you is that I've learned a lot from running this program, way more than I can talk about in 27 minutes. But I will tell you some of the most important things I've learned. One of the things I've learned has to do with these products. And I have to be honest, when I started this program, I thought most of these products were going to be as silly as this old picture of Bigfoot that's been debunked. And there certainly are some bad products out there. If you ever come across a product that we haven't written about, I would encourage you to look at this list of what we call the red flags. These are things that tend to be associated with the worst products that we've reviewed. And so if the thing that you're looking at has a lot of these red flags, it's probably not a good thing. So let me just read them to you. Large out-of-pocket cost. Nobody on the internet should be asking you for $10,000, $20,000, $50,000 for something that's never been proven to help. Second, advertised as effective for multiple incurable conditions which have different causes. I mean, if someone out there has a clinic and they say they're curing 50 of the world's worst diseases, how come they're not world famous and getting Nobel Prizes? The third is lack of safety and scientific oversight. The fourth is an absent or a limited consent process. Next is a lack of any sort of mechanism by which the intervention might help. Next is a lack of any sort of measurement of anything that's valid. Next is no plan to present those measurements at any kind of a conference or any sort of paper. Next is the only evidence of benefit is anecdotes. Next is that the person offering this has no relevant training. They're not a doctor, they're not a scientist, and yet they're trying to tell you how to treat your ALS. And then finally is the worst one, when the person selling you something is telling you to divorce yourself from all mainstream doctors and portraying themselves as a victim. We don't have the cure for ALS yet, but we do have a lot of things that can help you. And so we definitely don't want to see you divorce yourselves from us. But surprisingly, I've also found a lot of products that are very promising and warrant further study. Some have plausible mechanisms. Some have positive preclinical data. Some have positive, although flawed, human trials. And so some of the supplements that have positive human trials include acetyl L-carnitine, basis, curcumin, hyperimmune goat serum, L-serine, methylcobalamin, and TUDCA. And I definitely think those need more study. But without a doubt, the most amazing thing that I've learned from running this program is that lady I showed you in the video in the beginning, she's real. So I found her. I got to talk to her on the phone. She sent me her records. And lo and behold, she was diagnosed with ALS by a colleague of mine at the University of Virginia, someone I know and trust very well. And I had a chance to review all of her records, and I'm convinced she really had ALS. And she really did progress to where she was paralyzed and near death. And then over the next few years, she recovered. And it turns out she's not the only one. So as I started to look into this a little bit more, These so-called ALS reversals have been described in the medical literature since the 1960s, but they're not talked about, and nobody's ever tried to study them before. And to me, they're really important. We've got to try to study these folks. There's a precedent for studying people who are unexpectedly resistant to a disease. It's in HIV. These are called the elite controllers. They're about 1% of everyone who gets HIV, and they never get sick, even though they don't take medicine. And for a long time, people just shrugged their shoulders. And then someone decided to finally study these folks. And it turned out they had a common polymorphism in a gene called CCR5. So everybody said, well, what does that gene do? It turns out it codes for a protein in the surface of cells that HIV needs to get in. We never knew that before. And Pfizer jumped on this discovery and made a drug called Maraviroc, which helps everyone with HIV. So I believe that if we could understand how ALS reversals recovered, we might learn about a new pathway that we can manipulate and maybe make this happen a lot more often. So the first thing you have to do if you want to study something is define it. And this is the definition that I've come up with. I've got to actually have medical records that allow me to confirm a person's diagnosis, progression of weakness to where they're disabled, and then finally dramatic and persistent recovery of lost motor function. And to this day, I've found 60 people who meet this definition. Now, their recoveries are all different. They're not all as dramatic as the woman in the video, but I've got people who were dependent upon ventilators and now breathe on their own. People who couldn't swallow and had to have a feeding tube, and now they swallow normally. People who couldn't speak had to use a speech generating device, and now they speak normally. People who were wheelchair bound, and now they can walk and even run. People who were completely dependent on someone else for their activities of daily living, and now they do them on their own. And so I've decided to study these folks in two ways. One is a program called Study of ALS Reversals. And in this program, the hypothesis is that there's something different about these people in the first place, no matter what they do, sort of like the HIV elite controllers. And so I've got collaborators who are helping me study imaging, genetics, RNA and proteomics, the microbiome, environmental exposures, and autopsies. And if you ask me what's the most important thing that we've learned in the STAR program, I'll say there's two things. First, that some of these ALS reversals have positive family histories of ALS, and some even appear to have ALS causing genetic mutations. Why is that important? Because when I talk about these cases at scientific meetings, most people think these must not have been real ALS. They must have been ALS mimics. Well, I think that the family histories and the fact that some of them actually had ALS causing genes should argue against that. But even more interesting, we've just recently found that there's an unusual genetic polymorphism in about 30% of these ALS reversals. And this is plausibly related to how they recovered from the disease. It's in a gene that codes for insulin-like growth factor binding protein 7. We hardly ever see this polymorphism in people with typically progressive ALS. And what it's predicted to do is allow for more free IGF-1 to float around in the brains. And IGF-1 is something we've been talking about in ALS for 30 years. There even were some IGF-1 trials, but I don't think they were done very well. And so what I'd like to do next with this discovery is raise some money to help us collect blood and spinal fluid and maybe even establish cell lines from ALS reversals who have these polymorphisms and see what's different about those compartments of their body. My theory is that they have a lot more IGF-1 in their spinal fluid. And if that's true, then I want to go back and repeat one of the IGF-1 trials with today's modern technology. The other program is called Replication of ALS Reversals. So this hypothesizes that maybe some of these folks got better because of what they did. And so we're doing small pilot trials of the AOTs that are associated with the dramatic ALS reversals. Now, because most of these products are regarded as safe by groups like the FDA. And because I'm looking for such a big signal, like I'm not looking for a 20 or 30% slowing, I'm looking for people to recover completely from ALS. We can do some fun things with these trials that drug companies cannot do. We can have very wide inclusion criteria. We don't need placebo controls. We don't need a lot of in-person visits. We use online databases so we can make the results available almost in real time. And anytime we start one of these, we publish the protocol on a website called alsreversals.org. Why do we do this? Well, as I said in the beginning, a lot of people with ALS are out there and they're self-experimenting with things. And why not put a protocol out there that they could take to their doctor and say, hey, could I try what Rick Bedlack is trying at Duke? Here's the protocol that he's using. So we can give them a map to self-experiment with. Now, we've done a couple of these trials already with products called Lunasin and Therakermin. As you probably are aware, they did not reverse ALS. But what I can say is that this unique type of trial, it worked really well. We enrolled very quickly at about 10 patients per month. And we got, results for a fraction of the cost that most industry-sponsored trials have. And so we're going to capitalize on what we've learned from these early trials, as well as several emerging themes in the field to launch what I think is my most exciting trial yet. It's called the ROAR-DIGAP trial. And so this is going to have many of the same ROAR design features, but this time we're going to try to personalize treatments. There's a lot of discussion in the field now that ALS is probably not the same thing in everyone. And so maybe we need to start doing trials where we treat people differently based on the biology of their disease. And so there's a group in Australia called Genius. They've developed something which is called deep integrated genomics analysis. And what it is through short and long read sequencing, this looks at the entire genome. And it uses artificial intelligence to stratify people into the chemical reactions that are most likely killing their motor neurons. And so we're going to simplify this down to 4 categories. Category 1, neuroinflammation. Category 2, oxidative stress. Category 3, disrupted intracellular transport and autophagy. Category 4 is mitochondrial dysfunction. And depending on which pathway you're stratified into by DIGAP, you're going to get an AOT that has been associated with the previous reversal. So that'll open in early 2024. And so as I spoke to you today, I hope it became clear that AOTs are very, very popular amongst people living with ALS, and it's understandable. But the information about them, as they used to say on the X-Files, is not always easy to find. So anecdotal data in particular is what you most typically find on the internet, and it's super difficult to interpret. So we built this program called ALS Untangled to try to bring everyone together, patients, clinicians, and scientists, to try to understand these better and help folks make more informed decisions. Some anecdotes probably are worth paying attention to, but they have to be carefully validated. And we do have 60 validated ALS reversals. We don't yet know why these happened. No one does. Don't let someone on the internet tell you they know how somebody can reverse ALS, because no one knows how to do that yet. But we are studying them, and we've got some really interesting preliminary findings. So just want to say thanks to the people living with ALS out there. You're the reason I get up out of bed every day and work so hard to open up all these novel programs. So thank you for inspiring me. Thank you to all my funding sources, to my collaborators, and especially to my Duke ALS care team for helping me to build the foundation of great patient care upon which all my research is based.
はい、ベドラック先生、ありがとうございます。